Wicked Problems, Wolfpack Solutions is all about complex issues and innovative answers. As human beings, we have the capacity for unimaginable brilliance in our solutions, but also for unspeakable harm in how we contribute to problems. I want to talk to you about some of the darkest moments in human history, brought to you by eugenics. Eugenics is a pseudoscientific belief that certain traits, such as morality and intelligence, are inherited, and that by controlling which humans are allowed to reproduce and even to live, it is possible to create a human population with higher genetic quality. The concept of eugenics is now considered unethical, unscientific, and a violation of human rights, but it was popular in the 1900s, especially in the United States and Europe. It played a role in the atrocities committed by the Nazi Party and in the forced sterilization of people deemed unfit for reproduction in the United States and other countries. There are many ethical problems with the way that eugenics was justified and how it was used. And one of the big issues is that it's been used to support and promote racist beliefs and practices throughout history. To set the stage, let's talk about race for a minute. Race is defined as a grouping of humans based on shared physical or social qualities into categories generally viewed as distinct by society. Although race may seem biological, it's actually a social invention with no biological basis. Today, there is a growing recognition that race is not a scientifically valid way of categorizing people, and that there is more genetic variation within racial groups than between them. And the definitions and categories of race have varied across time and cultures, demonstrating that race is not a fixed and objective characteristic. This means that the way we understand and categorize race is not based on biological differences, but rather on subjective and societal perceptions and attitudes. Race is something we've created, a social construct. The term race wasn't really used until the 1500s, right around the time that the United States was being populated by Europeans. The concept of race was used to justify the ill treatment of oppressed groups of people. Racial myths have permeated our social world and are very much alive today. These myths have been accepted as conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom is tough to argue against because it seems like something we just know, even if there is no proof. These myths have been used to categorize people in demeaning and demoralizing ways. Some examples seen throughout history include Native Americans being viewed as savages, Black women being branded as welfare queens, Black men as criminals, Latinos and Mexican Americans specifically being viewed as illegal immigrants, and Muslims being viewed as terrorists and threatening. Although race is a social construct, because for the most part we can see race, it continues to be something that people tend to ascribe scientific meaning to. Scientific racism, sometimes referred to as biological racism, is the pseudoscientific belief that empirical evidence exists to support or justify racial discrimination, racial inferiority, and racial superiority. Scientific racism dates back to Thomas Jefferson in his Notes on the State of Virginia published in 1781, where Jefferson called upon science to justify the inferiority of Black people in order to classify them in a way which they could not enjoy the same rights and privileges of the white man. Scientific racism predisposed Americans to accept that social characteristics were inherited and deviant behavior was biologically determined. In other words, some people were predisposed to be inferior, and there was no amount of education or exposure that would correct what was scientifically determined. Fast forward over 240 years later, we see that there are many things that have happened in which race, science, and social justice intertwine. And one particular area in American history in which this happened was the sterilization movement, or eugenics. As I mentioned at the beginning, eugenics is a scientifically erroneous and immoral theory of genetic improvement. The idea of race played a seminal and decisive role in the ideological growth of eugenics during the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. Eugenics found serious traction in America. It can be traced back to English scientist Sir Francis Galton, who became obsessed with not only improving the quality of plants and animals, but humans as well. Galton felt that the same sort of selective breeding that had been used in plants and animals could be applied to humans. Galton coined the term eugenics from a Greek root meaning good in birth. Galton pushed for positive eugenics. The best of the white race was encouraged to procreate and have large families. Eugenicists wanted these supposedly fitter families to reproduce at a greater rate because they feared that many immigrant populations and blacks were reproducing faster. The sterilization movement in this country turned to a darker side, which we refer to as negative eugenics. The fitter families were not producing fast enough, and they felt that society could no longer depend on nature to eliminate the unfit. Negative eugenics was a step to keep the socially inadequate, the undesirables, from procreating. Race, along with both class and gender, became the central focus of eugenicists. In 1907, Indiana passed the first law to legally sterilize people and was quickly followed by over 30 states. In 1927, a sterilization case went to the Supreme Court and was upheld. Buck v. Veale involved a young woman by the name of Carrie Buck, who had been raped and gave birth to a daughter, Vivian. Carrie Buck was seen as unfit. Carrie was a resident of the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded, and while there, a petition was put forth for her to be sterilized. Carrie was 18 and was claimed to have the mental age of a 9-year-old. Carrie's infant daughter was evaluated and was deemed feeble-minded. Carrie Buck's mom, Emma, was also at the colony and was deemed feeble-minded as well. The Supreme Court ruled in a decision of 8-1 that it was in the state's best interest to sterilize Carrie, and in the words of the ruling, written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. This Supreme Court case led to the sterilization of over 65,000 Americans with mental illness or developmental disabilities from the 1920s to the 70s. This court ruling still stands today. Throughout the 20th century, nearly 70,000 people, overwhelmingly working-class women of color, were sterilized in over 30 states. Black women, Latino women, and Native American women were specifically targeted. These sterilizations were done under the guise of an appendectomy. The women were not only forcibly sterilized, they didn't even know it had happened. Black women were also disproportionately and forcibly sterilized and subjected to reproductive abuse. In North Carolina in the late 1960s, African American women made up 65% of the sterilizations of women, when they made up only 25% of the female population. Renowned civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer was a victim of a forced hysterectomy. Women of the South were victims of forced sterilization, also coined the Mississippi appendectomy. Race certainly had an impact on the eugenics movement in this country. Since the day in which the fate of Carrie Buck was determined by the Supreme Court, there have been instances where forced sterilization has impacted women, and especially women of color, disproportionately. Eugenics is an example of how many disciplines, medicine, politics, psychology, communication, etc., can be involved in wicked problems and their solutions. It is up to us to continue to make sure that we understand the racial disparities that continue to exist in society. If not, history will certainly repeat itself. As you grow through this course and through your college education and career, use your critical thinking skills to consider many things from all angles. Who is making decisions? Who is being impacted by those decisions? What evidence do we have for what we think we know? Who has a say in how we move forward? And how can you begin to question and challenge the assumptions and stereotypes you encounter and work towards creating a more just and equitable society for all?